The entire world of fake heroes was torn out of its reality and trapped inside another, a world where heroes were real. For the most powerful man in his universe, it should have been paradise. A clean new world, a fresh audience, a billion strangers who didn't yet know what he was. But this world already had a Superman, a real one, loved instead of feared, good instead of pretending. And Homelander was about to learn the one truth no amount of power could ever rewrite, that he was a copy. And copies are not loved, they are only feared. The reality shift didn't come with a flash of cosmic light. It came with a violent, ear-popping drop in barometric pressure. 1 second, Homelander was hovering a mile above Vought Tower, listening to the miserable, smog-choked hum of his city. He knew the exact frequency of it, the sirens, the gridlock, the millions of people grinding their teeth in the dark. Then his eardrums physically popped. The skyline snapped. The gray, oppressive concrete of his New York vanished, violently replaced by gleaming spires of impossible steel and spotless glass. The grid rearranged itself beneath his boots in a fraction of a second. Homelander hung suspended in the cold morning light. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He ran his super hearing outward, expanding his radius across the new city. It was wrong. The air tasted completely wrong. It lacked the heavy, metallic stink of car exhaust, rotting trash, and low-level panic. But worse than the smell was the sound. He focused on the streets below. Millions of people walking to work, buying coffee, hailing cabs. He listened to their heartbeats. They were slow, steady. Nobody was looking over their shoulder. There was no spike of adrenaline when a shadow passed over an alleyway. This entire population was walking around with the fat, unbothered ease of cattle that had never seen a slaughterhouse. They had never been taught to fear the sky. Homelander's jaw ticked. The muscles in his neck pulled tight. Then a slow, sickening heat flooded his chest. Absolute predatory hunger. He slowly turned in the air, his red cape catching the clean wind. They don't know me. The thought hit his nervous system like a direct injection of compound V. No Stan Edgar sitting behind a mahogany desk with a folder of his sins. No butcher bleeding in an alley. No leaked video files. No PR disasters to scrub. Just 8 million completely oblivious strangers. A pristine, untapped market. Homelander had spent his entire manufactured, laboratory-grown life begging for scraps of adoration from a public he secretly despised. Now, he was looking at an entire world that hadn't yet been trained to flinch when he smiled. The corners of his mouth twitched. His lips pulled back over his teeth. It wasn't a hero's smile. It was the desperate, starving grin of a god who had just found a new church. Here, he thought, looking down at a city that didn't know enough to be afraid, he could finally have it. He descended. He chose his landing the way he chose everything, for the audience. A broad plaza near the heart of the city, glass towers rising on every side, a fountain throwing light, hundreds of people crossing it in the unhurried current of a normal morning. He came down slowly, deliberately, letting them see him. The descent of a god, cape spread, the morning sun catching the gold of him. The whole performance he had given 1,000 times to 1,000 crowds who had learned to gasp and cheer on cue. He touched down in the center of the plaza and he straightened, and he gave them the smile. The good one. The one that had sold $1 billion of merchandise and covered 100 murders. He waited for the worship. It did not come the way it was supposed to. They noticed him, of course. How could they not? A man in red, white, and blue had just dropped out of the sky into the middle of their morning. People stopped. People stared. A few lifted their phones. But the thing Homelander had come to expect in the half-second after every landing, the thing he needed the way other men needed air, the wave of awe, the cheer, the terrified adoration of a crowd that knew exactly how much smaller than him they were, that thing did not arrive. The faces turned toward him held curiosity, a little confusion, the mild, unguarded interest of people looking at something unusual but not, somehow, frightening. A woman near the fountain tilted her head at him, the way one might at a street performer in an unfamiliar costume. A teenager actually laughed, not cruelly, just surprised, and said something to his friend that Homelander's hearing caught across the whole length of the plaza. "Think it's like a promo for a movie?" The smile stayed fixed on Homelander's face. Underneath it, something cold turned over. He had been adored and he had been hated, and he understood both, because both were a kind of power he had over the people who felt them. What he was looking at now was neither. People were not awed by him. They were not afraid of him. They were unimpressed, in the specific, casual way of a crowd that had seen the genuine article so many times that a man flying out of the sky had stopped being a miracle. And that, the indifference, the bored familiarity with the impossible, landed in Homelander like the first crack in a pane of glass, fine and silent and spreading. "It's all right," he told them, spreading his hands, pouring the warmth into his voice. "You're safe. I'm one of the good ones." He gestured up toward the gleaming towers, the clean sky. "I'm here to protect you." A man in a delivery uniform glanced up from his phone with an expression that was almost kind. "Yeah, man," he said. "We've kind of got that covered." "We've got that covered." Homelander stood very still in the middle of the plaza, and for the first time since he had opened his eyes over this strange, clean world, the hunger curdled into something else. He could hear it now that he was listening for it, woven all through the ordinary noise of the city, in conversations and ringtones and the murmur of 100 screens. A name, a shape. They said it the way his own world had never said anything about him, lightly, easily, with the bone-deep, unthinking trust of children who have never once been let down. There was already someone here, someone who flew, someone who saved them, someone they did not fear because they had never been given a reason to, a protector this world took as much for granted as the sunrise. His enhanced vision swept upward, across the skyline, hunting, and found it at last on the side of a tall building near the city's heart. A symbol, a shield. Not his eagle, not Vought's blood-red logo, but a different mark entirely. Simple and clean and worn by these people the way his world wore his, except that where his world's worship had always carried the faint, sour undertone of terror, this symbol carried none at all. It was loved. Purely, simply, without the fear that had always been the secret price of every cheer Homelander had ever earned. A god already sat in this world's sky, and this god was loved. The cold thing in Homelander's chest finished its slow turn and settled. He kept the smile on his face. He was very good at the smile. It was the last thing to ever leave him, but behind it, in the engineered dark where a normal man kept a soul, the first true unease of his new life took root. He had crossed into a paradise, a clean world, a fresh audience, a blank page on which to finally write the love he had always been owed. He had thought it a gift. And in the space of a single morning, he had begun to understand that the page was not blank at all. Something had been written here long before he arrived, and the people of this world had already given the thing he craved most completely, freely, without a single drop of fear, to someone else. There was room in any sky for only one sun. Homelander rose slowly back into the cold morning air, leaving the plaza and its unimpressed crowd beneath him, and he turned his gleaming, pitiless gaze toward the symbol on the distant tower. The hunger had not gone. It had only changed shape. He had come into this world wanting to be worshipped by it. Now, looking at the mark of a god who already was, he felt the old familiar thing rise in him. The thing Vought had built into his bones and could never quite control. The thing that had always answered the unbearable ache of not being loved with the simpler, colder satisfaction of being feared. If this world already had a protector it adored, Homelander thought, then this world had a problem. Because two suns could not share a sky, and he had never in his whole manufactured life learned how to be the lesser light. Far across the city, on the side of that distant tower, the symbol caught the morning sun and shone, and somewhere beneath it, a man this world trusted completely went about the quiet work of being everything Homelander, only knew how to pretend to be. They had not met yet, but the sky had room for only one of them, and the most dangerous being in two worlds had just decided which. Homelander was idling a mile above the metropolis, the freezing wind violently snapping his cape against his calves, when he felt the barometric pressure shift. Someone was approaching from the dead glare of the sun. He didn't hear thrusters. He didn't hear the violent, sonic crack of displaced air that usually accompanied a flyer breaking the sound barrier. He turned, and the man was already there. Blue suit, red cape, a massive, absurd shield branded across his chest. The stranger slowed to a halt 12 feet away in the freezing air, his posture as casual as a man waiting for a train. He didn't hover with the rigid, muscle-locked tension Homelander used to project dominance. He just existed. Homelander's jaw locked. His X-ray vision flared automatically, stripping the stranger down to his biology. Muse. Clee density. Bone structure. He listened for the heartbeat. He waited for the inevitable, frantic spike of adrenaline, the quickening pulse that meant the prey knew it was standing in front of the apex predator. Nothing. The man's heart was beating, with the slow, maddening rhythm of a metronome. "Well," Homelander said. His facial muscles snapped into the trademark, focus-tested Vought smile. "You must be the welcoming committee." Something like that. The man's voice was warm, no edge, no posturing. I felt the atmospheric displacement a lot of people did. He offered a small, completely unguarded smile. "That was a rough entry. You all right? You look like you just woke up in the wrong house." Homelander's smile froze. Behind his eyes, his nervous system violently misfired. This wasn't the script. When two alpha-tier sups met, it was a biological negotiation. You flexed, you traded thinly veiled threats, you established who was going to bleed if things went south. It was the only language Vought had ever beaten into him. But this guy wasn't speaking it. There was no ego holstered at his hip. He had flown up to a localized weapon of mass destruction, and his first instinct was to ask if he needed a medic. "I'm fine," Homelander said. The skin around his eyes tightened, pulling the smile into something plastic and sharp. "Better than fine. Beautiful city you've got down there." He drifted a slow, predatory half-circle, his red boots scraping against the empty air. "Clean, friendly. 8 million people walking around like absolutely nothing up here could drop down and rip them in half." He let the silence hang, waiting for the flinch. Somebody must have worked very hard to build that kind of delusion. The stranger didn't tense. He just rotated his shoulders to keep Homelander in view. That absolute, baseline steadiness was suddenly more terrifying than a drawn weapon. "We try to keep them safe," the man said simply. "I'm Superman, that's what they call me anyway." He tilted his head, his blue eyes completely unblinking. "And you are?" "Superman." The word hit Homelander under the ribs like a physical strike. Not Captain anything, not a corporate trademark, not a numbered ranking in a boardroom demographic. Superman. As if the title was an indisputable law of physics. As if this man had simply claimed the absolute ceiling of existence without a single PR firm telling him he was allowed to. Homelander had spent his entire pathetic, blood-soaked life being managed into the illusion of godhood. He stared at the man in blue, a cold, sickening nausea twisting violently in his gut, realizing for the first time in his life that he was looking at the real thing. "Homelander," he said. "They call me Homelander." "Homelander." Superman repeated it without mockery, trying it out, the way a decent man learns a stranger's name. "Where are you from? Because I've been over every inch of this planet and I've never seen anyone fly like you do." It should have been the opening Homelander wanted. A rival admitting he'd never seen the like. But it didn't sound like fear, and it didn't sound like awe, and it didn't sound like the wary respect of one apex predator for another. It sounded like curiosity. Friendly, open, genuinely interested curiosity. the kind you offer a guest, and Homelander discovered that he had no idea what to do with it, because in his whole manufactured existence, he had been met with worship and met with terror and met with the smiling contempt of the people who held his leash. But he had never, not once, been met with simple, unafraid kindness. And the kindness frightened him in a way that nothing in either world ever had. Then it got worse. Below them, 3 streets over, a sound cut up through the morning, the shriek of tires, the wrong heavy crunch of metal, a bus skidding sideways across a wet intersection toward a crowd that had no time to scatter. Homelander heard it. He always heard everything, and in the half-second it took him to decide whether the moment was worth the performance, whether there were cameras, whether saving these particular strangers would buy him anything worth the effort. Superman was already gone. He did not announce it. He did not pose. There was no speech, no spread of the cape for an absent audience, no PR team scrambling to capture the angle. He simply moved, a blue and red streak folding the distance to nothing, and by the time Homelander had drifted down to watch, it was already done. The bus stopped dead and gentle inches from the crowd, held in 2 outstretched hands, the people behind it gasping and then, almost immediately, grinning because of course he'd caught it, of course he had. This was Tuesday. This was simply what the sky did for them here. A child waved. Superman set the bus down softly, checked the driver with a hand on his shoulder and a quiet word, and rose back into the air, and he had not asked for a single thing in return. No cheer was owed. No. Camera had been required. No body in a New Jersey warehouse would need to be made to disappear to keep the story clean, because there was no story to keep clean. There was only a man who had power and used it, instantly and completely, to keep strangers from dying, and then went back to his conversation as though it had cost him nothing at all. And Homelander, watching from the cold air above, felt the crack he had first heard in the plaza widen into a fracture that ran all the way down. Because that was the thing. That was the performance he had given 1,000 times and never once met. He had staged rescues exactly like that, had hired the actors and rigged the bus and counted on the cameras, had built an entire empire of merchandise and adoration on the careful, expensive imitation of precisely what this man had just done by reflex, for free, for no one watching but a child who would forget by lunch. Everything Homelander did, this man simply was. Everything Homelander faked, this man bled real without thinking about it. The smile, the flight, the shield, the role of the world's beloved protector. Homelander had spent his life wearing the costume of it, and here, drifting back up toward him with that maddening calm, was the thing the costume had always been a poor copy of. He was not looking at a rival. He was looking at the original, and he was the forgery. "You didn't even hesitate," Homelander heard himself say, and he hated the thinness in his own voice, the crack he couldn't quite seal. "You didn't, there weren't even any cameras." Superman gave him a slightly puzzled look as though the sentence didn't fully parse. "There were people," he said simply. "That's the only part that matters." Then softer, reading something in Homelander's face that Homelander would have given anything to hide. "Hey, are you sure you're all right? You went somewhere just now." The concern was the unbearable part. Not the power. Homelander could have matched himself against power, could have raged at being merely outmatched. It was the decency, offered freely to a stranger, the genuine flicker of worry in a being who owed him nothing and somehow cared anyway. It held a mirror up to the empty, engineered place where Homelander's own soul should have been, and in the reflection he saw, with sudden and total clarity, exactly what he was. A thing built to look like this. A thing that had spent its whole life being feared, because it had never once been able to earn what this man received without trying. The most powerful being in his entire world, and he was a counterfeit of the one floating in front of him. And the people of this world had already given the man their love completely, freely, without the price of fear that had stained every cheer Homelander had ever bought. The smile came back onto Homelander's face. It was the last thing to ever leave him, and it was working very hard now. "I'm perfect," he said, "never better." He drifted back, putting air between them, and the warmth in his voice had gone glassy and bright and wrong. It's a lot to take in, a whole new world, and it already has its hero. He let the word hero sit there a beat too long. Lucky them. There's room for more than one good person in a world this big, Superman said, and he meant it, every guileless syllable of it, and that was the cruelest thing he could possibly have said. If you want to help, there's always more than enough to do. We could use the hands. We, as though Homelander could be folded so easily into the chorus. As though the most dangerous being in two universes were simply a promising new volunteer. I'm sure you could, Homelander said. He held the smile until Superman, after one last searching look, gave him a nod, open, hopeful, trusting. The nod of a man who genuinely believed the stranger he just met might turn out to be a friend. And then dropped away toward the city to answer some other call only he had heard. Homelander watched him go, watched the blue streak vanish between the bright, clean towers of a world that loved its sun and didn't even know enough to fear it. And the fracture inside him finished spreading into something cold and quiet and final. He had come into this world starving to be loved. He had found, instead, the living proof that he never could be, not while that existed, not while the people had something real to compare him to. Every kindness Superman had shown him in the last 5 minutes had been a fresh cut, and Homelander, hanging alone in the high cold air, did the only thing his engineering had ever taught him to do with a wound. He decided whose fault it was. Two suns could not share a sky. He had known it from the moment he'd seen the symbol on the tower. He simply hadn't known, until now, how much it was going to hurt, and Homelander had spent his entire life learning to convert that particular hurt into something far more useful and far more dangerous than GR. Eve. He would be smiling when he did it. He was always smiling. There is a question every creature must eventually face, and Homelander had spent billions of dollars and a lifetime of staged miracles making certain he never would. What are you, really, when no one is afraid of you and no one loves you either? For 3 days, the new world made him ask it. He started the way he had always started because charm had never failed him before. If this world already had a hero it adored, then Homelander would simply give it a second one, a brighter one, a better one, and let the people choose. He found a fire in the city's east end, a genuine one, no actors and no rigging, and he descended into the smoke like the sun coming down to earth. He carried people out in his arms. He smiled for the phones. He said all the right things in all the right tones, the warmth he had perfected over decades of practice. And when it was done, he stood in the ash and the strobing red light and waited for the thing he had come for. It came a little, a few cheers, some grateful tears, a reporter asking his name. And then someone in the crowd said, quietly, the 4 words that would follow Homelander through everything that came after. Where's the real one? Homelander's smile did not move. The real one. He turned toward the voice, a man, ordinary, soot-streaked, looking past Homelander at the empty sky as though waiting for the blue and red streak that always came. And Homelander understood that even here, in the middle of a genuine rescue he had performed flawlessly, the people were comparing him to him, and finding the copy wanting. He had walked through fire to be loved, and the only question they had for him was where the man they actually trusted had gone. He kept smiling. He was always smiling. But somewhere inside, a door he had spent his life holding shut moved a half-inch on its hinge. If they would not love him for being good, he reasoned, then he would make them awe him for being powerful. That was the other currency he understood. So the next day he gave them a spectacle. He flew higher than this world's hero ever bothered to, fast enough to drag a thunderclap across the whole city. And then he hung above the towers and showed them what he was, the heat vision carving a line of fire across the morning sky, a display of raw force meant to dazzle, to remind 8 million strangers exactly how small they were beside him. In his own world, that had always worked. Power was the language his world spoke, and fear was the dialect, and a crowd that knew how badly he could hurt them had always been a crowd that cheered the loudest. This world did not cheer. This world went quiet. Phones came up, but not in adoration, in the wary, instinctive way people film a fire or a car wreck, a thing that frightens them. Parents pulled children indoors. The easy, unbothered ease that had so unsettled him on the first morning curdled, street by street, into something he recognized at last, something familiar and warm and wrong: fear. He had reached for awe and gotten dread, and the terrible part, the part that made the door inside him swing another inch, was how good the dread felt after 3 days of being unimpressive. At least the fear was a kind of power. At least the fear meant they were looking at him. He told himself it was the same as worship. He had been telling himself that his whole life. But the question kept circling back, and now it had teeth. Why did they love the other one without ever fearing him? Homelander had to flex, had to threaten, had to remind them of the abyss, and still they only flinched. Superman never flexed at all, never carved fire across the sky, never made a single soul afraid, and they handed him their hearts. Homelander watched him do it. He followed the blue streak through the city like a man worrying a wound, and he saw the hero stop to fix a stranger's stalled car, saw him kneel to talk to a frightened kid at eye level, saw him take a punch from some armored lunatic and not hit back nearly as hard as he could have, pulling the blow, holding the limit, refusing to be as terrible as he so obviously was. And Homelander, watching, came to the conclusion that would damn them all. His weak. That was the lie the wound told him, and he believed it because believing it was the only thing that didn't hurt. The restraint wasn't strength, it was softness. The kindness wasn't goodness, it was an act, a longer con than even Vought had ever run, and these gullible people had simply never been shown what real power looked like. They loved Superman because they had never been given a reason not to. They had never seen him lose. They had never watched their god be made small. A new idea was forming behind Homelander's pale eyes, and it was the worst idea he had ever had, and it felt, to him, like clarity. He decided to test it. There was a bridge on the city's north side, crowded with morning traffic, and home. Homelander chose it the way a cruel child chooses an anthill, not out of need, but out of a need to see. He came down onto it without warning, and he did something small and quiet and monstrous. He took hold of one of the great support cables and, smiling all the while, began, very slowly, to bend it. Not to drop the bridge. Not yet. Just enough. Just enough to make the steel groan and the cars stop, and the people spill out screaming. Just enough to feel the fear roll off of them in a wave. Just enough to send up a flare that he knew, would bring the blue streak running. He wanted to see what the real one would do. He wanted to see him afraid. The screaming reached its pitch. The cable shrieked, and Homelander stood at the center of all that terror with his head tilted, listening, waiting, savoring the closest thing to love he had felt since he arrived. And that was the moment a shadow crossed the sun, and a voice he already hated said, very calmly from the air above him, "Let it go, Homelander." He looked up and Superman was there. No anger in him. No fear either, and that absence, that infuriating, impossible absence of the fear Homelander had built the whole obscene display to provoke, was the spark that finally caught. "You came," Homelander said, and he was grinning now, wide and bright and broken. "Good, I wanted you to see." He gave the cable another fractional twist, and a fresh wave of screaming rose, and he watched Superman's face for the flinch that would prove he was just a man in a costume after all. "These people think you're a god, but you won't even show them what you can really do, will you? You hold back, you pull your punches, you let them think the world is safe." The smile sharpened to a blade. "I think they deserve to know the truth. I think they deserve to know how it feels when one of us stops pretending." "Put it down," Superman said. "Whatever's happening to you, whatever brought you here, we can talk about it, but not like this, not with them in the middle. We can talk about it. The decency again. The unbearable, bottomless decency, offered even now, even with a bridge full of innocence hanging on Homelander's whim. And in that instant, Homelander finally understood the shape of the thing that had been clawing at him since the plaza, the truth he had circled for 3 days, and the understanding settled into him cold and clean and final. It wasn't that Superman was more powerful. He might be. It wasn't even that the world loved him. It was that as long as Superman existed, gentle, restrained, beloved, real, Homelander would forever be the comparison that came up short. The copy, the forgery, the one they only feared. There was no display bright enough, no rescue grand enough, no spectacle of power vast enough to make these people love him, because the moment they looked at him they would always be measuring him against the genuine article hanging in their sky. You could not win love away from a man like that. But you could remove him. You could erase the standard. You could take away the thing they compared you to, and then, with no original left to expose the copy, perhaps, finally, the worship would have nowhere else to go. Homelander let go of the cable. The bridge held. The people wept and fled, and Superman exhaled, and for a moment the most dangerous being in 2 worlds simply hung there in the air, smiling his perfect smile at the man he had just decided to kill. "You're right," Homelander said softly. "Let's talk." He drifted backward, light as ash, his eyes never leaving Superman's. "Soon, just the 2 of us, somewhere these people can watch." The smile widened. "I think they're going to learn a lot about their hero." And then he was gone, a streak of red and white and blue against the bright, clean sky, leaving Superman alone above the trembling bridge with the dawning, sickening certainty that something in the stranger had just changed, that a line had been crossed somewhere behind those pale eyes, and that whatever came next would not be a misunderstanding to be talked through. Superman did not yet know what Homelander had decided. But he had heard the thing underneath the smile, the way you hear the first crack run through ice a half-second before it gives. And for the first time since the new world arrived, the man this reality trusted with its life felt something he was not at all used to feeling. He felt afraid. Not for himself. For everyone. The cameras were off, and that was when the cracks showed. In the small, dead hours, high atop the tallest tower in a city that had never asked for him, Homelander sat alone in the dark and watched the new world love someone else. He had taken to doing this, pulling the broadcasts out of the air with his hearing, the news feeds, the breathless reports of another rescue, another life saved, another ordinary miracle performed by the man in blue and received by a grateful world as casually as weather. He watched the way a starving man watches a window full of bread. And somewhere in the watching, the godlike mask he had worn his whole life began, very quietly, to slip. Because Homelander understood now that he had been engineered for exactly one thing, and that the thing had been a lie. They had built him in a laboratory. He had no mother. He had been raised by men in white coats who measured his strength and recorded his rages and never once held him, who taught a child that he was a god and treated him as a product, who gave him the whole sky to rule and not a single soul to love him in it. Vought had poured a fortune into making the most powerful being the world had ever seen, and they had forgotten, or never cared, to make him a person who could survive being one. He had spent his life papering over that hollow place with worship, buying with fear and merchandise and staged adoration, a thing he had never been given for free. It had almost been enough. As long as he had never seen the real thing, the counterfeit had almost been enough. And then this world had shown him a man who had been loved, really loved, by a family, by a world, freely and without fear. And the comparison had reached down through 40 years of careful armor and touched the abandoned child still screaming at the bottom of him. The child no laboratory had ever soothed. The child who had only ever wanted what Superman was given by the bucketful and never asked to earn. Homelander did not have the tools to grieve. He had never been given them, so the grief came out the only way it knew how. It started with the people closest to him. Vought's world had been trapped here too, the handlers, the executives, the rest of the 7, all of them swept into this clean, bright reality alongside him. And one of them, A nervous woman who had spent a career learning to manage his moods made the mistake of trying to manage this one. She came to him with talking points. She told him the public image numbers were a concern. She suggested, gently, with the careful phrasing of someone defusing a bomb, that perhaps Homelander might consider a different approach, something softer, something more like. And she did not finish the sentence because she saw, far too late, exactly which word had been about to come out of her mouth. More like Superman. Say it, Homelander told her. He was smiling, he was always smiling. You were going to say his name, go on, say it to my face. She did not say it. She apologized. She backed toward the door, and that was when the paranoia which had been building in him like pressure behind a dam finally found its first crack to pour through. Because if she was comparing him to the other one, if his own people were measuring him and finding him wanting, then who else was? All of them. Had they been laughing at him this whole time, the way the man in the plaza had laughed, the way the whole new world flinched? Were they already planning to replace him with the cleaner model the moment they could? What he did to her, the others would not speak of afterward. They only knew that she did not come back, and that the smile never left his face while it happened, and that something in Homelander had crossed a line that night that it would not be crossing back over. After that, the unraveling accelerated, and the cost began to climb. The paranoia turned total. He saw the conspiracy everywhere now, in the wary glances of strangers, in the news anchors who said the other one's name with warmth and his with caution, in the way this world's other heroes had begun, quietly, to keep their distance and their eyes on him. He decided they were all in on it, the whole reality conspiring to humiliate him, to prop up their false god and grind the real one down. And a creature that believes the entire world is against it will, eventually, decide to be against the entire world. The harm spilled out of him in widening circles. A confrontation with one of this world's costumed protectors, someone who came, reasonably, to ask him to stand down, ended with the protector in a crater and a city block on fire and Homelander hovering above it, breathing hard, telling himself it had been self-defense. A crowd that gathered to film him scattered when his head turned toward them too fast, and he let them run, and he hated how good their fear tasted, and hated that he needed it, and hated, most of all, that even their terror was not the thing he wanted. He could make this entire world afraid of him. He was roving it block by block, life by life. And it still wasn't love, and the gap between the two was the wound that no amount of fear could ever fill. And the more it failed to fill it, the harder he pressed. And the harder he pressed, the more of this innocent world he broke. The man in blue came, again and again, and tried to stop him without becoming him. That was the thing Homelander could not forgive, that even now, even with the fires and the craters and the climbing count of the dead, Superman held back. He pulled his strikes. He led Homelander away from the crowds rather than through them. He kept trying with that unbearable, bottomless patience to reach him. "I know something's wrong," Superman said to him once, the two of them locked in the burning sky above a city learning to be afraid. "I don't know what they did to you, or where you came from, or what's breaking in you. But there are people down there who didn't do any of it, and they're the ones paying for it. Let me help you. It doesn't have to end this way." And Homelander, hanging in the smoke, heard the kindness in it. And the kindness was the cruelest blow of all because it was real, and it was offered to him freely, the way nothing in his whole manufactured life had ever been offered freely, and 40 years too late. "You want to help me," Homelander said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle, the god's voice and the child's voice both at once. "Where were you, my whole life, where were you?" He didn't know who he was asking. He didn't know if he meant Superman or the men in the white coats or the mother he had never had or the whole indifferent universe that had built him to be worshipped and forgot to make him someone who could bear it. You get all of it, the family, the world. All of them looking at you like you hung the sun. And you never even had to be afraid of losing it, did you? You never had to earn it. The smile was gone now, entirely gone, and what was underneath it was the rawest and most terrible thing this clean new world had ever seen. Not a god, not a monster, but a wounded child with the power to end everything. I did everything right. I did everything, and they still picked you. For one suspended moment, hanging there in the smoke with his ruin spread out beneath him, Homelander was not frightening at all. He was only sad unbearably, irredeemably sad, a thing that had never been loved and never would be, weeping in the high cold air, and even Superman, who had spent days fighting him, felt his heart break at the sight of it. And that, the pity, was the last thing Homelander's pride could survive. He saw it on the other man's face, the compassion, the sorrow, the awful gentle understanding, and where another creature might have reached for it like a drowning man for a hand, the wound in Homelander twisted it into the final unforgivable insult. He did not want to be pitied by the thing that had everything. He would rather be feared by it. He would rather be hated by it. He would rather burn the whole shining world to ash than stand in its sky one more day as the object of its kindness. "Don't," Homelander whispered, and the smile came back, and it was the worst smile anyone had ever seen because there was nothing left behind it at all. "Don't you dare feel sorry for me." Then he turned, and he looked down at the city, really looked at it, the millions of small, bright lives that had committed the one crime he could not forgive, the crime of loving someone who was not him, and somewhere in the wreckage of the manufactured child, a decision finished forming that had been forming since the plaza. If he could not have their love and could not bear their pity, then he would have the only thing left that a god could take. He would show them what it cost to choose the wrong son. He drew in a breath, and his eyes began, slowly, to glow, and high above a city that did not yet know how thoroughly it had been doomed by its own kindness, the falling god opened his mouth to speak the sentence that would begin the end. What he said next, Superman would spend the rest of his life wishing he had reached him one moment sooner to stop. He did not burn the city down. He did something he believed was worse. The glow faded from Homelander's eyes, and instead of the heat vision the watching world braced for, he reached out with the part of himself that had always been his truest weapon. Not the strength, not the lasers, but the broadcast. He was a creature of screens made by a media empire, and he knew that the surest way to kill a god was not to break his body, but to break the love that kept him a god. So he seized every screen in the city at once. He took the news feeds, the billboards, the phones, the great glowing faces of the towers, and he put his own perfect smile on all of them, and he spoke to the entire trembling world in the warm and reasonable voice he had spent a lifetime perfecting. "People of this beautiful world," Homelander said, and 8 million faces turned up toward 8 million screens. "I need to tell you the truth about your hero." This was his plan, the thing the unraveling had finally birthed. If he could not win their love away from Superman, he would poison it. He would tell them their god held back because he was weak, that the safe, clean world they trusted was a lie, that the man in blue was a fraud who let them believe in a fairy tale. And then, when their faith was rotten, when the comparison was finally dragged down to his level, perhaps there would be room in their hearts for the one who had been honest enough to show them what power really was. He opened his mouth to begin the lie, and the screens cut out from under him. For a heartbeat, the whole city went dark, and then the screens came back, all of them, every billboard and phone and tower, and the face on them was no longer Homelander's. It was footage. Grainy, ugly, real footage. The kind no PR team had ever been allowed to scrub, spliced together and broadcast to 2 worlds at once by 2 men who had spent their entire lives gathering exactly this. A scarred man in a long coat and a frightened young man at a laptop. The cynics who had hunted Homelander across his own reality and been dragged into this one right alongside him. The boys had been waiting for this their whole lives. What played across those screens this clean new world had never imagined. The covered-up murders, the rescues that had been staged over fresh corpses, the passengers Homelander had let a plane full of innocents die rather than be filmed failing to save them. The lie, decades of it. The whole rotten architecture of a god built by a corporation and protected by money and washed clean for the cameras. All of it, finally, with no one left to bury it. And over the footage came the voice of the scarred man, flat and merciless. That's your new hero, mate. That's what the smiling bastard really is. We've spent years trying to show our world the truth. Figured this one deserved a look before it's too late. Homelander hung in the air above the city, and for the first time he felt the ground of the thing he had built his whole life upon begin to give way beneath him. Because the people were watching, and they were not afraid now, they were horrified, which was different, which was worse. He could survive being feared. He had been feared his whole life. But to be exposed, to have the curtain torn down in front of the very audience he had come to win, to stand naked as the counterfeit he was before a world that had a real one to compare him to, that was a wound the engineering had left no armor against. And then, on the rooftop below him, the thing that finally broke him stepped out of the shadows. Starlight. She was one of his own, a member of the Seven, swept into this world with the rest of them, the one with the conscience she had spent years choking down to survive. And now, with the whole city watching, she stopped hiding. She stood up beside the cynics who had once been her enemies, beside the man in blue who had shown a whole reality what power was supposed to be, and she lifted her chin, and she said the words into the broadcast that Homelander could not bear, because they came from one of his own kind. "He's right," Annie said, and her voice shook, and she said it anyway. "Everything they're showing you is true. I know because I was there. I let it happen because I was afraid of him." She looked up past the camera, straight at Homelander hanging in the sky. "But I'm not doing it anymore. You don't have to be afraid of him either. Power doesn't have to mean this. It never did. Look up." Her voice steadied, and something in it caught and held like a struck match cupped against the wind. "Look at the other one. That's what it's supposed to look like." And the world looked up. That was the moment the mirror was held up fully, from every side at once, and Homelander could not look away from any of it. The cynics had shown the world what he did. Starlight had shown the world that even his own kind, given the choice, chose to be good. And there, rising slowly into the air to hang between Homelander and the city he had been about to poison, was Superman, who had heard every word of the broadcast, who knew now the full ugly history of the thing he'd been trying to save, and who looked at Homelander not with the hatred Homelander could have used, not even with the pity that had broken him before, but with something far more devastating. He looked at him with recognition. "I understand now," Superman said quietly, and the whole world heard it. "What they made you, what they did to you and never gave you." He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "You were built to be loved and raised to be feared, and no one ever taught you the difference, and that isn't your fault. It's the cruelest thing I've ever heard. A breath. But you've had a choice. Every single day since you got here, they showed you a whole world that would have helped you, and every day you chose this." He gestured slowly at the fires, the craters, the frightened millions. "I can't be sorry for you anymore. There are too many people who needed me not to be." And Homelander, hanging in the high cold air with two worlds watching, understood completely, finally, in a single unbearable instant, the truth he had spent his entire existence and a whole new world's worth of cruelty trying to outrun. He could be the most powerful being in two universes. He had proven it, and it would never matter, because power had never been the thing he was missing. The man floating in front of him had less of it, held it back, used it gently, and was loved by a world that would have torn itself apart to defend him, while Homelander, who could have leveled cities, who would never in all his endless life be loved by a single living soul. Not because he wasn't strong enough, because of what he was, a copy. A forgery, a wound in the shape of a man, made in a lab and abandoned to a sky, who had been given everything except the one thing that would have let him use it well. He had wanted to be real. He had wanted, beneath all the worship and all the rage, only to be the genuine article, and he was standing in front of it, and he never, ever could be. The recognition shattered something in him that no blow ever had. But as he broke, the strangest thing happened in the city below. the thing he had spent the whole story trying to prevent. The people, who had just been shown the worst truth imaginable about a god in their sky, did not curl up in despair. They looked at the footage of what Homelander was, and then they looked up at the man hanging steadfast between them and the monster, at the one who had refused to become what he was fighting, and something in them, fragile and stubborn and defiant, began to kindle. Because the lie had been exposed, yes, but so had the truth standing right beside it. They had been shown a false god and a real one in the same breath, and against every reason to despair, they chose to believe in the real one. A few voices at first, then more, not afraid, hopeful. The first true ember of it catching in the dark precisely because the false god was finally, visibly, coming apart. Homelander heard it, the hope, rising up from the streets toward Superman like warmth toward a sun. And it was the one thing in all of this that he could not endure. He had been exposed, abandoned, and seen, and he had survived all three, barely, in the way a shattered thing survives. But to hang here and listen to that hope rise toward someone else, to be made to witness the love he could never have being born again right in front of him, stronger for his breaking, that was the thing his ruined soul finally refused. The smile came back. It was the worst it had ever been, because there was no person left behind it at all. "You're right," Homelander said softly to Superman, to the watching world, to the rising tide of a hope that would never, ever be his. "I can't be that. I see it now. I can't be loved. I can't be real." His eyes began slowly to glow again, and this time nothing in this world or any other was going to talk him down. "But I've finally figured out the one thing I can do." He looked down at the people, at the fragile ember of hope catching in the dark below, and his quiet voice carried to every corner of two trembling worlds. "If I can't have it," he said, "then no one gets to." And the most dangerous being in all of creation turned his full and terrible attention not on the man in blue, but on the hope itself, on the millions of small, bright lives daring to believe again, and prepared to burn every last ember of it out of the world forever. He turned his eyes on the hope itself, and he began to burn. Not Superman. That was the thing the man in blue had braced for, the blow he'd positioned himself to take, and it never came, because Homelander had finally understood that killing the real one would only make a martyr of him, and a martyr is loved forever. So instead he aimed lower and crueler and truer to the broken thing he'd become. He aimed at the people, at the ember, at the millions of small, bright lives that had just dared, against everything, to believe again. If he could not be their hope, and could not bear their pity, and could not even drag their hero down to his level, then he would do the one thing left to a god who had failed at all the rest. He would teach them, in fire, that believing was a mistake. He would make sure no living soul ever looked up at a sky and felt safe again. The heat vision swept across the city, and the cost the whole story had been climbing toward arrived all at once. It is not a thing the survivors would ever fully describe, the minutes when a god decided to murder hope by murdering the people who held it. Buildings opened like STR. Matches. The streets that had been so unbothered on that first clean morning filled with the sound this world had never learned to make. And Superman moved through all of it the way he had moved through every disaster of his life, faster than thought, catching what could be caught, shielding who could be shielded, his body between the fire and the innocent again and again and again. And for the first time in his life, it was not enough. He could not be everywhere. No one could. And as Homelander rained ruin on a world that had done nothing but love someone better, the count of the lost began to climb past anything Superman could carry, and the clean, innocent reality he had spent his life protecting died, a little in front of him, and would not be coming back clean. It was Starlight who bought him the moment that mattered, and she bought it with everything she had. Annie had spent years hiding, choking down her conscience to survive a monster, and the night before she had finally stopped. Now, with the city burning and the people scattering and Homelander's fire sweeping toward a crowd too large and too slow to save, she did not hide. She put herself in front of them. She lit up with everything that was in her, all the light she had spent so long pretending she didn't have, and she held the line, held Homelander's fury off 1,000 fleeing strangers for the handful of seconds it took them to reach cover. She was not as strong as he was. She had never been. She had only ever been braver, and in the end that was the thing that cost her, the way it so often costs the brave. And when the light finally went out of her, it went out facing the monster, between him and the people, exactly where she had chosen to stand. Superman caught her as she fell. There was nothing left to be done, and something in the man this world trusted with its life, something that had held for his entire life, came very close in that moment to breaking. He laid her down gently, and he rose into the burning sky. And for the first time, the people below saw their hero look the way Homelander had always looked, like a being who could end the world and was deciding whether to. The two gods met in the air above the ruin, and the clash that followed was nothing like the careful, restrained dances Superman had fought before. He did not hold back now. He could not afford to, and a part of him, the part that had just laid a brave woman down in the rubble, no longer wanted to. He drove Homelander out of the sky and into the earth and back into the sky, blow for terrible blow, and Homelander, who had wanted exactly this, who had been trying to provoke exactly this since the bridge, laughed through the blood, because finally, he was getting the real thing to fight him like a real thing, and that was almost as good as being loved. And then it was over, the way these things end suddenly after going on too long. Superman stood over him in the wreckage of a city that would never be the same, and Homelander lay beaten beneath him, broken at last, the godlike body finally failing, the smile flickering. And Superman's hand was raised, and every instinct he had, every ounce of grief for Annie and for the lost and for the clean world that was gone, screamed at him to bring it down, to end this, to make certain it could never happen again. He was strong enough. No one would have blamed him. The whole watching, grieving world would have understood. Homelander saw it in his face, and the broken thing on the ground did the last cruel thing it had left to do. "Do it," Homelander whispered, and he was smiling through the blood with the dregs of something that might have been triumph. "Go on, be what I am. Prove there's no difference between us. Prove the only thing power ever does is this." His pale eyes found Superman's, and the whole of his ruined soul was in them. "You kill me and you prove I was right all along, that a god is just a monster the world hasn't caught yet, that there's no such thing as a real one." The smile widened, terrible and final. "Give me that. Let me win the only way I've got left." That was the truth at the bottom of everything, the thing Homelander had been reaching for since the moment he fell into this world and found it loved someone better. He could not be hope, so he had tried to burn it. When that failed because it had failed, because the people below, even now, even grieving, even buried in ash, were already turning their faces back toward the light, already choosing to believe again in defiance of everything, already proving that hope had never depended on any god at all, he had one gambit left. He could make the real one a killer. He could prove that there was no real one, that power always corrupted, that Superman was only a Homelander who hadn't been pushed far enough yet. It was the last victory available to him, and it was the only thing he had ever truly wanted, to not be alone in what he was. Superman held his hand in the air for a long moment. And then he lowered it. "No," Superman said. His voice was hoarse with grief and shaking with the effort of the thing he was choosing. "You don't get that. You don't get to make me into the proof of your worst idea about the world." He looked down at the broken god, and there was no hatred in it and no pity either, only a terrible, exhausted clarity. Power was always a choice, every single day. You chose this over and over with a whole world holding out its hand to you, and I'm choosing now. He stepped back. "I'm not going to be the thing that lets you off easy. You don't get to die a martyr. You get to live with exactly what you are and with the fact that you couldn't burn it out of them. They're already looking up again, without you, despite you, the one thing you wanted most and you couldn't even take it away. And that, not the beating, not the broken body, but the truth of it, the recognition that he had failed at every single thing, that he could not be loved and could not be real and could not be good, and could not even prove that no one else could be either. That was the blow that finally finished Homelander. The most powerful being in two worlds, undone at the last not by force, but by the unbearable fact of what he was, the manufactured child who had been given everything except the one thing that mattered and had spent his whole life trying to set fire to the world for it. The smile finally left his face. And the false god, beaten and exposed and alone in a way no creature had ever been alone, simply came apart, the body failing, the light going out, the long fall from the sky that the whole world had always, secretly, been waiting for. He fell, and he was not loved as he fell, and he was not feared, and he was not even hated. He was only, at the very last, seen for exactly the small and broken and terrible thing he had always been. When it was over, the city was burning, and the dead were beyond counting, and the clean, bright world that had greeted Homelander on his first morning was gone forever. That was the part no one could undo. The worlds had been trapped together, the rot poured into the garden, and even with the false god fallen, there was no separating them now, no clean morning to go back to. This reality had learned what its own innocence had never let it imagine, that a thing with the face of a hero could be a monster, that the sky was not always safe, that even a world watched over by something good could be made to bleed. They had lost too many. They had lost Annie, who had stopped hiding only long enough to die for them. They had watched their truest hero pushed to the very edge of the line that would have unmade him, and seen how close it had been. The innocence did not come back. Innocence never does. And yet, in the wreckage, in the ash, in the long gray dawn after, the people of that scarred world did the thing Homelander had spent his whole short, violent life unable to understand. They looked up. Not because they had been told to, not out of fear, not on cameras, but because somewhere in the ruin a man in blue was still standing, grieving and battered and refusing to be anything other than what he was, and somewhere in themselves they had decided, against every reason the last days had given them, to go on believing that power could choose to be kind. It was not the bright, easy faith of that first clean morning. It was something smaller and harder and infinitely more costly. An ember where there had been a sun, but it was burning, and the wind of everything that had happened had not, in the end, been able to put it out. The world had paid for that ember in a currency it could never earn back. It had buried its dead and lost its innocence, and watched its god come within an inch of becoming a monster to save it. But it had learned the thing the false god died never understanding. That hope was never something a god handed down from the sky. It was something the people chose in the dark, at terrible cost, again and again, even after they had every reason in the world to stop. Homelander had fallen into a world built on that choice, and mistaken it for a thing he could steal, or counterfeit, or burn. He had been wrong. He had been wrong about everything. And in the cold, grieving dawn over a city that would carry its scars forever, a battered world looked up at the surviving light and barely kept believing anyway. That was the price of hope, and it had never, in all of two universes, been worth more.